All right, we're live there, drinky.
You're listening to Coding Blocks Episode 4.
Subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app. And be sure to give us reviews on iTunes and Stitcher. Visit us at codingblocks.net where you can find show notes, examples, discussions, and more. And send your feedback and questions, comments, rants to comments@codingblocks.net.
And with that, welcome to Coding Blocks.
I'm Joe Zach.
I'm Michael Outlaw.
And I'm Alan Underwood.
And this week we're going to be talking a little bit about application security, specifically the OWASP Top 10. So OWASP is an organization, they're a 501c3, whatever, nonprofit that are focused on improving the security of software worldwide. And their mission is to make software secure through visibility so that individuals and organizations can make more informed decisions and just kind of know what's out there. And I think it actually stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. So that's OWASP, kind of like the bug. And what they've done with this top 10 is they've looked at hundreds of organizations, thousands of applications, and over 500,000 vulnerabilities to kind of catalog and gather up and look at what the top 10 threats are based on a variety of things like the prevalence, the exploitability, the impact, and how easy it is to detect these problems. And if you go to their website, they actually have a bunch of books and merchandise on sale, so you can read about them, support them, and get a cool hat too.
And that's at OWASP.org.
Also, I wanted to mention that a lot of this security development lifecycle stuff and threat modeling stuff that we'll be talking about was developed initially by Microsoft. They literally wrote the books on this stuff. And so a lot of the books, like literally called Secure Development Lifecycle and Threat Modeling, are available on like Amazon.com. Particularly relevant to OWASP are the notions of stride and dread.
And what exactly is stride?
Are we talking about the acronym here?
Yeah.
Wikipedia says stride is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege.
So pretty much what every hacker's trying to do.
Yeah, there's different types of attacks. And dread is a way of calculating a sort of numerical score for rating your risk. And so what you do is it stands for damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. So if you had some sort of vulnerability, you might categorize it in saying the damage is a 3 out of 10, reproducibility is a 9 out of 10, affected users 10 out of 10, and discoverability is a 1. You know, that gives you some sort of score back, so you can kind of bang these things against each other and sort them, kind of figure out like a priority list for your organization.
And if you get the high score, your initials stay up there all the way up until we lose power.
And also I want to mention the notion of defense in depth. So we're going to be talking about this OWASP Top 10, and we'll be throwing out a couple solutions for some of these items. But I wanted to keep in mind that a lot of the stuff that you can do is really based on your environment, and it's not really enough to just have one fix. A lot of these things, there's a lot of different ways in there. And there's a kind of a cute saying that's popular, saying that the defender has to defend against everything, and the attacker only has to get one successful attack in order to be successful. So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. So another way of saying defense in depth would be saying not just using strong passwords, but also using roles and permissions.
Right, and HTTPS.
Multiple layers of security on top of one another.
Right. Don't rely on the system. Don't rely on the system to do everything for you. You're also going to need to check things yourself as well.
Right. And also, one last thing to mention before we kind of dive in, two last things, is there's a tool called WebGoat that's provided by OWASP at OWASP.org that is a purposefully broken ASP.NET web application. And it's got little exercises that you can do to try and actually kind of break in and see what they could have done differently to prevent that sort of attack. It's really cool. Finally, wanted to mention Troy Hunt, at Troy Hunt on Twitter. He's actually got a fantastic series looking at the OWASP Top 10 a couple years ago that actually goes into each one in depth and does a great analysis and explanation of what's going on, specifically tailored to .NET. And you can also watch, I think it's like 8 hours of videos on Pluralsight.
Yeah, and he can be found at troyhunt.com. And even though it might be a little dated, it's still good information because these items still stay in the top 10. They might shuffle around, but for the most part, they're the same vulnerabilities have been hanging around.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from 2010 to 2013, really, there's been a few things that moved down the list a little bit, and they attribute a lot of that to the fact that it's shown up on the OWASP top 10 for so long. So, this information's all still extremely relevant. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about the number 10 vulnerability that's out there right now.
Yeah, so we're going to be going through these backwards.
Just
make that clear.
Yes. Countdown.
Yes.
So counting down from 10. Yep. Unwanted redirects and forwards.
Yeah, this one's kind of interesting, right? We've probably all seen this at some point and never really thought too much about it. But if you ever see in a URL, you'll sometimes see a URL .aspx or .php or something, and there'll be a variable in the query string that'll be like, redirect to or something like that, and then it'll have a page in there. And that kind of stuff can be hijacked and send you somewhere that you don't necessarily want to be. And so it's really kind of up to your application to make sure that whatever is up there is something that you think should actually happen. So you don't want people being sent off to malicious sites. So one of the ways to get around this is to basically have a whitelist, right?
Right, and maybe only let you be redirected to your own domain, the domain that you're on, or maybe a whitelist of domains. And I think a good example of this is like if you get an email that says, you've got a Facebook message, you click on the link, and you're not logged in. So it bounces you to a login form where you log in, and then it's got sometimes up in the URL maybe, or a form field that tells you where to go next, basically what action you were trying to take before they interrupted you and made you log in. And if this is available to an attacker, then they can kind of trick you into going to this login page and then bouncing you to, facebook.cn, which looks like the page you wanted to go to, but is actually, kind of a like a keylogger or whatever.
Yep. Hey, it seems fairly obvious, but it's definitely something that probably a lot of places don't really concern themselves with because they just expect everything to be valid. And pretty much the whole concept behind OWASP in many of these vulnerabilities is that if you don't control the inputs, then it has to be considered untrusted. So these redirect URLs, these variables are things that you need to make sure are safe.
Yeah, and so as we go through these, we're going to bring up some famous, well-known hacks that happened that relate to these, and I believe the most recent one for this was the Adobe hack, right?
Yep. Raise your hand in your car, wherever you are, if you were one of the 38 million accounts that were affected.
Yeah, that would be the three of us.
I know I was.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We all got
speaking
emails.
Of that one, since that one is so current, though, too, we should probably mention that LastPass has lastpass.com/Adobe. You can actually check to see if your email was one of the ones included in that hack.
Yeah, unfortunately mine showed up. Hey, you were there.
Mm-hmm. And that's much better than say Googling for the Adobe emails.
Yeah,
the places you have to go to get this information are not the places that you should be going.
Yeah, you'll probably be flagged.
Yeah.
So, with that one then, we're going to step on to the number 9 vulnerability, which is using components with known vulnerabilities. So, I mean, honestly, I don't think anybody's going to do this on purpose, but some of the examples that were given directly from OWASP were the Apache CFX authentication bypass. Basically, if you didn't put in an identity token, you had access to every single web service available. That's pretty huge.
It might be a feature.
Yeah, I suppose. And then another one that they mentioned was Spring, a very popular Java platform, or what do you call it? Not a platform, geez.
Framework.
Framework, there we go, yes.
Stuff.
There was actually a vulnerability in that would allow you to take over the server. So Spring is huge. I mean, tons of organizations use it. Tons of Java programmers out there do. So it's not necessarily that you're going out of your way to pick anything,
Well,
right?
I mean, OWASP doesn't specifically mention this one, but wouldn't I would think that the most common one for this would be file formats. There's been some recent. In fact, just this past Patch Tuesday, Microsoft released a big TIFF patch fix. There have been numerous ones from Adobe for PDF files, which ironically this OWASP documentation from
That's a little
OWASP is a PDF.
Yeah, delivered in PDF.
There were some other ones too. Microsoft has had a bunch of. Well, there was font ones that have happened.
Oh yeah.
One, they moved stuff down into the kernel layer, and that just brought up a whole slew of stuff. I mean, those are more operating system level, but I don't know. I was kind of surprised that they didn't list that as one of the components with known vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I guess when they're talking about components, I guess they're specifically talking about programming components. So, you don't want to go grab a library that has security vulnerabilities in it. But, chances are you're not trying to do that anyway. So I guess the key here is really make sure you keep everything up to date with patches and that kind of stuff, right? I mean, if you go use a third-party library, keep it up to date.
You guys aren't going to mention WordPress?
Oh, yeah. There's been a few of those.
Yeah, an old version of WordPress is a sure way to get hacked. But even the newer ones aren't exactly known for being safe. And a lot of it's due to the plugins. But if someone could figure out what version of WordPress you're on, that can be an issue.
Yep.
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about versions, then that pretty much applies to anything. Then
everything,
yeah,
right?
Unsupported operating systems,
Patch
what
them
language
all.
you're on,
Windows,
what version of the server,
keep it all up to
OS
date.
or server software.
Which, unfortunately, right, one of the big problems with that, though, is when you start patching things and keeping things up to date, it inevitably breaks something else you coded, right? I mean, and that's one of the frustrating things, and I think that's why a lot of people don't keep all their stuff up to date. But, I mean...
You can't be lazy about
yeah,
it, though, this day and
you
age.
have to bite the bullet and do it.
And it's funny, too. I'm sure everyone's seen that screen where they get an error message on a website, like a bank website or something. It says, MySQL error, version 5.01.
Right.
Oops.
Yep.
Right. So moving on to number 8, cross-site request forgery. And this is always kind of a weird one to explain, but I think it's easiest to just kind of do it through an example. You'll see, if you ever notice on Amazon.com, they make you log in a lot, and it's really annoying. So it seems to happen pretty much every time I try to go add something to my cart or go visit orders or something. It's like they know I'm already logged in, they know my cart, they know some of my stuff, they know my wish list. But as soon as I try to do an action that like takes money or does something that could hurt me, they make me re-authenticate if it's been a while, or I'm not really sure what the rules are around it. But they do this in order to prevent someone from kind of slipping me a link that might trick me into, say, adding an item to my cart or adding an item to my cart and checking out. Or for your bank, you could actually, potentially slip someone a link that transfers money to account or something like that.
Yeah, it's one of the most popular ones out there was a takeover kind of Google.br for the Brazil version of Google. And what it is these companies basically faked information being sent to a site. So a site expects a certain set of headers, a certain payload, a certain URL, and essentially what happens is another site knows all the information that the one site is looking for, and in order to do this, they generate their own requests to that site, and they send malicious payloads along with it.
Yeah, it was a man-in-the-middle attack.
Yes, it's exactly what it is. And
it was happening at the router level, consumer router level. It was changing your DNS entries to go through it, and then acting as the man in the middle to intercept the request that you wanted. And behind the scenes, it may make a real request. It may also do some malicious stuff. But
well, in that case, what they were doing is they were redirecting people not to the real Google.br, but to one that looked very similar, and then they were basically installing malware and that kind of stuff on it. So being that they took over the DNS, they literally, it looked like you were at google.br, but you were actually sitting on another server out there that was basically putting bad stuff on your computer.
Yeah, I think this one could pretty much be summed up with if you have to do anything secure, you want to do it through SSL. Then that way you can trust the payload, end to end.
Yep, and you can also do something like appending a URL token, like a unique token per user or per transaction, either in the form or in the URL, to kind of verify that action was expected.
Yeah, so something that was generated on your side beforehand that you expect to get back on the return. Another way that people do that as well is they make sure that you only accept, again, going back to the whitelist, is you only accept requests from a particular domain. So while the man in the middle thing is kind of what they did, they only were able to achieve that because they basically strung together a whole bunch of these things. So if you don't allow external sites to post to your forms or whatever, you need to make sure that whatever post data comes in actually originated from your site. So those are several different ways that you can kind of mitigate this problem.
And that can be pretty tough to do, and I think that's where that unique field comes in. It's just something that you gave the customer that they're giving back to you that you didn't then discard afterwards. So it's kind of like a single-use token or unique to that session. And there's actually OWASP actually has a pretty good tool, a CSRF tester, that can help generate test cases to demonstrate the dangers of CSRF flaws.
Very nice.
All right, well, let's move on to number 7, missing function level access control.
Better known as authorization, right? Pretty much.
So,
like, what's an example of this?
All right, so one example that was given, I believe, was if you had like directory permissions, right? So not allowing them to get into an admin path unless they were actually, authenticated in. Right? They couldn't just change their path to be like whatever they wanted.
Okay, right. And I've seen it before where like the index page or something in a directory requires you to be logged in, but you don't necessarily have to be logged in to access another file in that same directory because it only checks on that, like the login form. And that also, any sort of application security that makes sure that you're logged in doesn't apply to other things in that folder like Excel files or text files or, password files or whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about WordPress earlier, and while it's not necessarily part of this particular vulnerability, the idea is you can go in and you can look at the entire code base and you know what the admin pages themselves are. So if you actually knew the URL to get there and the authorization wasn't implemented properly, then you could just go straight to the page and do whatever. So that's kind of what this whole thing is you know where the page is or you know how to access the thing. And if the authorization is not in place, then you could potentially do things that you shouldn't be allowed to do. So.
Yep.
Yeah. So the one for that was the famous one for that would be the Apple AT&T iPad email hacks that happened back when the first iPad was released. Apple kind of gets the bad name for it, but it was really, if I recall, on AT&T's side where the hack was happening, where the user could just change the query string and could start farming, harvesting all the email addresses for AT&T registered iPads.
That's unfortunate. And one thing that's bad about this one in particular is that automated tools aren't very likely to find these things. It really it helps to have the kind of an insider's knowledge to this. You need to know what those files are, what the technology file structure looks like underneath.
Yeah, so that was an example of the two where like he had access to do his task, but he didn't have access to start grabbing other people's email addresses too. So that's a different take on the access level, right? Like you might have access to your stuff, but not necessarily to my account.
Yep. All right, so number 6, sensitive data exposure. So there's a lot of different ways this can happen, like storing sensitive data in the clear, plain text. An example I always like to think of is, too, if sometimes sensitive information is logged. Like, have you ever seen like some sort of logging framework that logs all the inputs and outputs to various components, and oops, you accidentally logged a CV2 number or something like that. I think that would count as sensitive data exposure. So usually the restrictions applied to logs aren't as strict as, say, the credit card table. This also applies to like weak or bad crypto. Not sure. One thing I'm not sure about is if this counts for like exposing like we talked about MySQL, like exposing version numbers of things. I don't really think that counts as sensitive data here. What do you guys think?
Well, I think that counts as server misconfiguration.
Yeah.
But I think like one that was talked about was if you flipping to SSL at the wrong time. So like on your login page, you went across as HTTP, right? And then you enter in your username and password, click submit, and then you'd come back SSL. But by then it's too late. You already sent everything in the clear.
Yep.
Right. So that was already too late. Or another example would be putting sensitive data into the URL.
Absolutely.
Right. As a parameter in the URL.
Well, one of the examples that they give in the OWASP documentation, and this one was kind of interesting, but let's say that you have credit cards going into the database being encrypted, but they're being encrypted at the database. So as they're going in, they're being encrypted. Well, to get them back out, the database is actually what's doing the decrypting. So anybody who gains access to your database can now decrypt all the data coming back out. So that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, is also separating out those layers a little bit so that, the data can't be accessed right where it lies. Even though it's encrypted, it was a weak encryption. So
one of the more general versions of this, though, too, would have to do with passwords getting out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether the how to phrase this, the type of encryption quotes that is used versus hashing, or if it wasn't properly salted, those have been famous leaks that have happened as well, right?
Yep. And one thing to mention about this one too is, we mentioned that these are kind of graded, and these top 10 come from, combining prevalence and exploitability and detectability, etc. And this is the only one in the top 10 that they list as being difficult to exploit. And because that, does require having access to those files or the database or whatever. However, I think this one's still in the top 10 because the impacts of having sensitive data exposed are quite severe.
Yeah, this one's huge. I mean, if somebody gets access to all your customer credit cards or social security numbers, if you're a healthcare provider or something like that, you could almost just shut your doors, right? I mean, unless you're a huge company, that might be a blow that you're not going to recover from.
I'm trying to think of like what the most recent password hack that happened was. There was the Adobe hack that happened, but
there have been so many.
I thought there was another one. For a while, like LulzSec and Anonymous, they were just
eating everybody up. Yeah.
LulzSec in particular, I think they did some damage to Sony. But
that wasn't this one. Yeah, that wasn't.
No. I know that. But where I was going with that though is that back to like the passwords that were either stored in the clear, or they weren't properly salted and hashed. There was one recently where it happened, and they started looking at because one of the things that has been coming out about this has been kind of interesting is seeing the common passwords that people are using, right? I think like on Twit or Security Now, they've mentioned Monkey as being like one of the most popular passwords that people have used over the years. But that stuff's being found out now because of these hacks that are happening, because the data was just stored to where it could be easily retrieved.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and particularly with the Adobe hack, I remember hearing that a lot of people were looking at the security questions and answers, and so
Rhymes
they would
with
see
password.
yeah. They mean, and then one hint might be starts with P. The next one might be rhymes with assword. And if you put enough of these hints together, you can figure out what that security question answer was.
Well, this is where the salting goes with the exposing that sensitive data, because if your password hint is rhymes with assword, and I see that your hash matches Alan's hash,
yeah, you got them both.
Maybe Alan has a really good hint given to his. It doesn't matter because I know what his is. So I mean, if it's salted correctly, then I shouldn't.
You can't put two and two
together.
together.
See those,
right,
together.
Yeah, so that's a big one. That's always going to be a very big one, is trying to make sure you secure your data properly.
Yeah, and this is another one that's hard for tools to find automatically.
Yep. So moving on to number 5, and this one's a pretty big one. This one's security misconfiguration. And, this one's unfortunate because it's so easy to gloss over when you're installing software and doing everything else. I mean, it takes a lot of work to secure things properly, right? I mean, quite a bit of work.
Security guys get paid big money.
They really do. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a big one. I mean, if you don't lock down privileges on your software, your hardware, it's very exploitable.
Yeah, and a lot of times, secure software is insecure by default. Like like routers and stuff that you might buy at Best Buy or whatever. For a long time there, in the early days of like Wi-Fi, they would have they would all use the default address 192. Admin. Yeah, and they all have even the same name. It'd be like Netgear router. So you could get a pretty good idea of what that password's going to be for most people.
I mean, we talked about it at the beginning where Microsoft literally wrote the book on this stuff, right? And that's because they got hammered so much. I mean, like the first version of XP, like it was wide open for everything. It wasn't until like one of the later security packs where it actually had a firewall and ports turned off by default.
Right. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, in fairness, Microsoft got hammered because they were the big boys on the block. But that's also why they know about a lot of this stuff. That's also why when we all installed Windows 7 and Windows 8, every time you went to install a piece of software, it prompts you with 5 million prompts. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you really sure you want to do this? Mm-hmm. Come on. I don't know that you really want to do this. So
yeah. One example I like to give is a couple years ago, I was working somewhere that happened to reuse the same password in a lot of different places. And somehow someone got into one server, and then they were just able to use the same password they used to get into that server and to get into pretty much everything else.
Okay, but I mean, like, so in this security misconfiguration, though, there's a couple good examples that come to mind, though, from a .NET perspective. So we kind of hinted on a moment ago with the verbose error pages, right? So every .NET developer, you've seen the the yellow screen messages, server application error, and then some long exception message, but then at the bottom it'll have like the version of IIS that you're running and .NET that you're running, right? Like that would be an example of one that you would not want to expose to external clients, which is good that the you have the ability to turn that on off for remote. But another example that came to mind too, as you were mentioning the passwords that were being reused, is leaving the passwords not encrypted in your web config files.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are other things mentioned when you set up a server. There's a ton of things turned on by default that you don't use. If you don't use them, they should be turned off. Yeah. Your application directory listing, like in Apache, a lot of times would be turned on. You can see all the files in there. Turn that stuff off. You don't want people to see that. It usually boils down to, and again, that's why I said this one's so frustrating, is you have to know kind of what you're looking for to turn off in most cases. I mean, you install your server and all the software to go with it. If you're not aware of every little thing you need to turn off, you really should find out from somebody or do some searching.
I'll give you the most basic one that I can think of, right? Ping.
Oh, absolutely.
Why? Okay, so from a default server perspective, in my opinion, why do you want to let somebody know that you're there? Right? For that kind of an address, right?
For a DDoS attack. Just let them know.
Just don't even reply.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, maybe I'm taking it a bit too far, and it's certainly outside of the realm of .NET. But yeah, so in the concept of default little things being on that you don't really think about, right? Unless you actually sit down and you're like, oh yeah, I don't actually need ping turned on.
Yeah.
And one example I like is, you don't see this so much anymore, but application servers or applications sometimes that come with sample applications built in. Like if you install IIS on like a Windows 7 box or something, it creates a default website for you. And so if that default website, that which you may have forgotten about, has some sort of vulnerability, then you have a vulnerability too. That kind of thing doesn't happen too much anymore. But
I do all my shopping at Northwind.
Yeah, you're right. Oh, and the one last thing is, and they hit on it pretty big here, is, again, going back to patches. Make sure all your software is up to date. If you haven't patched your server in 6 months, well, it's on you. So, make sure you keep all your code libraries up to date. If you're working on old libraries, well, you're at the mercy of whatever's going to happen there. So, try and keep your stuff up to date.
All right. So with that, we'll move on to number 4, insecure direct object references.
Insecure direct object references.
Yeah, it's so clear, right?
4,000.
Yeah. So, no, this one's actually kind of cool. This is, if I remember right, wasn't this Citibank that got...
Yeah, this was the Citibank hack.
Yeah, where they let go like 200,000 accounts or something. It's really interesting. So essentially, what this one boils down to, I guess you kind of want to know what it is. When you look up in a URL and you see user ID equal 25, is a number. Typically, when you see that, you usually know that in the database that's probably a sequential auto increment field. And so what happened is, somebody had actually logged in to a Citibank account, had seen the user account information or the account number up at the top, and they were like, well, let me go ahead and change that account number and see if I can see what the next information is. And so they just kept adding one to it. And essentially, they were able to gain access. So through lack of authorization controls, basically this person should have only been able to see their own account. Through lack of authorization, and through a little bit of just, peeping around, they were able to access over 200,000 accounts and grab that information. So essentially, this insecure direct object references focuses on authorization, but then they say you can also take it a step further. And instead of showing account number 12345 in the URL, behind the scenes, you might have a session table that maps 12345 to a GUID or something, that you then show in the URL, and then when something gets passed back, it'll look that information back up in the session that you have, and then try and map it back to the real entity. So,
it's kind of interesting though, because this one really, it seems very similar to the missing function level access control, right? I mean, it actually walks it's like a border between that and just shy of a SQL injection, right?
Absolutely.
Because you're not really doing... When I think SQL injection or just injection in general, that's more malicious. But
right.
This one, you're actually just... you're just changing the value of a parameter, and that parameter then isn't being checked to see if that's something that you have access to, but yet letting you get back to it. So it's kind of weird that it's not merged in with the access level.
It's the name of it. So what they're saying is insecure direct object references. And just to be clear, from all the reading and listening I did on this particular topic, they said in most cases it's not necessary to do the insecure direct object reference, meaning that you don't need to necessarily create something to obfuscate the real ID. If you're a bank, absolutely. You don't want to be showing the account numbers in the URLs or in any hidden fields or anything like that. So in those cases, they said if you are a bank, then yes, behind the scenes, you should probably be creating like a dictionary that says, okay, account number 12345 is going to now be this GUID in the browser, right? So that nobody can reverse engineer that stuff, because it's a throwaway. It's a one-time key. right? So I think that's why this one is specifically set aside for that, because in cases where you do need that, this can be extremely important. But if you're just a regular website that's, you don't have anything crucial to hide from anybody, you're not exposing personal information or anything like that, do you need to go through all the trouble? Because this is actually a decent amount of programming, right? I mean, if you're going to be rolling your own session tables behind the scenes to map to something that's kind of fake on the site.
Well, but I think the point though is that, like, if you're going to have parameters, say in the URL that are exposed,
only good for that session though.
Yeah, they should only be for that user. Don't. Yeah, because that's the whole point, is not allowing the user to just be able to change that value to get to Joe's account data, right?
Yeah, you change the order number in the the URL, and now you're seeing someone else's confirmation. You want to verify that order is associated with the logged in user.
Right. So you can either handle it through authorization, which is what they say for most people is probably fine, but
or the session indirection.
Yeah. But if you are a bank or you are somebody handling Social Security numbers and stuff, then you probably should start looking into that indirect object references.
All right, so we're going to make our way into the top 3.
Woo! Does anyone want to guess what number 3 is?
Well, I could cheat.
Yeah.
Do we want to wait for a listener to call in?
Right.
Yeah, waiting. Still waiting.
Yeah.
All right, number 3 is cross-site scripting, the infamous XSS.
I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, this one's really easy to kind of accidentally slip in to a site and not realize. And what's really bad about this is it's really easy for automated tools to find these. And the consequences are dire.
Mm-hmm.
So I've actually seen a demo where someone was able to find a small cross-site scripting vulnerability, and they use it to inject a JavaScript file, which then pulled a remote server for instructions on what to do with that person's session. And so they were able to wreak all sorts of havoc and add stuff to cart and pop-ups, redirect the person to their own URL. I mean, just everything. The cat was out of the bag.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is when you hear the term cross-site scripting, you automatically think external, right? Because that's what it sounds like. But when you read the documents that the OWASP has prepared, that's not always necessarily the case. It's putting stuff on your page that does malicious things, right?
Yeah, and it's the common way to think about it is usually form fields and URL fields, but there's also a variant called stored cross-site scripting attacks where maybe I put my name in some other website as alert something or other in JavaScript, and then later when someone in the admin piece is going through and looking at customer records, all of a sudden my name gets executed as JavaScript, which is no bueno.
So, I mean, just to be clear, what we're talking about here is if you have you have a form field, you allow the user to enter some data, and then that data is going to be displayed, later in a page.
So I think XSS is specific to code executing. So you put some JavaScript in the field. It doesn't actually have to be JavaScript. Yeah. You could inject some Ruby into a Ruby app or something as well, and that code actually gets executed later.
So the big example here was the MySpace hack that happened, and that's what it was. It was, the guy had this gigantic, JavaScript that he was able to put into a form field, and it was actually a worm that propagated throughout the MySpace community that, all of a sudden he was more popular than Tom.
That is right.
The good news is this is an easy thing to fix. All you have to do is properly encode the data that you show on the website. And you should do this not for just URL and form fields, as we said, but also pretty much for everything. So, if someone can get something into a database, and when you display that data from the database, you need to be properly encoding it for HTTP or HTML or whatever format you're showing. Yeah,
that's a great point, though, too, because there's different encodings for JavaScript, for HTTP, for XML,
CSS, all of it.
Yeah. And so you have to be really specific about where you're going to how you're gonna put that into the code.
And I think one thing to note here, seeing as how we do talk about .NET a lot, that was interesting, is that out of the box, MVC is way more secure than web forms out of the box. And the reason is because web forms doesn't do everything consistently. It'll encode some attributes of a control, but not others. So the tooltip might not be encoded while the other stuff is encoded. So there's
I think an example that was discussed, that Troy discussed in one of his presentations, was label versus button.
Is that what it was?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think it was the, if you took the value from a form field and just stuck it in, I think button was encoded but label was not, if I recall correctly.
It's the same piece of data.
So
yeah. And that's in web forms, and so you have to be a little bit more diligent if you were using web forms in trying to ensure that you are encoding all the data properly. Whereas in MVC, pretty much they said out of the box, like everything encodes everything. So you're already a bit further in the safety of that.
So according to OWASP, though, cross-site scripting is the most prevalent web application security flaw.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It's number 3 on the list here, but it's the most prevalent security flaw.
And it makes perfect sense. I mean, it takes a lot of work to lock these things down, right? Because another thing that has been mentioned that I find interesting is it's not that you just have to worry about things coming into your page. It might be things from your database that you're displaying on your page.
Well,
they
that's
got
the
in there.
stored example that Joe gave, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And speaking of that, we mentioned sanitizing output, but you also want to sanitize that on the way in, so you can prevent those stored attacks on other people who may not have sanitized their output.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to mention that a lot of people will sometimes they'll try to do some sort of blacklisting to try and prevent this thing. They'll look for script tags, or they'll look for single quotes in the URL. But you can get away with all sorts of stuff by like URL encoding the values, or all sorts of different tricks that end up kind of putting that information back together in a very bad way. So really, HTML encoding that stuff is the way to go for web apps.
And another thing, speaking of that, with the URL encoding and all that, one of the things that Troy did bring up in his presentation that I thought was awesome is the way a lot of hackers are getting away with stuff like this, is they use URL shorteners so that you can't actually see what's in it. So if you're on Twitter and you see this link from TinyURL or from Twit, or what is it now? I can't even remember.
Bitly.
Yeah, Bitly, and then twit.co or whatever it is. You're not actually going to see what you're about to go to. So when you click it, you could get something in the URL that's bad. And so it's pretty interesting. And it could be taking you to a perfectly legit site, but that site has vulnerabilities that are then exposed through the URL itself. So there are a lot of ways that this can be hijacked, and that's why it's probably number 3 on the list here.
Yep.
Yeah. So moving on to number 2, broken authentication and session management.
Yeah.
So that's just what it says.
Right.
Yeah, the example that OWASP gave was having the session ID in the URL, and then let's say I buy some concert tickets. There's a TM company that sells some tickets that we all know and love because their prices are so awesome.
Oh yeah.
And so and I'm like, hey Joe, I got the tickets and I want to send you a link showing you the confirmation or something, but I'm not meaning for you to be like actually get in my account. But accidentally maybe I just gave you if the session was in the URL, then maybe you could go in and then continue on as me and order whatever you wanted to, right? And
the server can't distinguish between us, so I am you
Right.
as far as they're concerned.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And the interesting thing is that would be fairly harmless if you sent it to Joe. The problem is now, today with social media, more than likely you're going to tweet that out, be like, check out the tickets I just bought.
Yeah, and me.
Well, I mean, not that this one was bad, but I mean, you bring up that example, and it was just last night that I saw a tweet from Tony Hawk, who had posted up the Mini Cooper had their configurator where you could you build your car and configure it and save it, and he had tweeted, "Hey, here's the new Mini I'm getting." So yeah, I mean, could you
Hope
imagine?
he didn't have his credit card saved. Someone's getting a couple minis.
That's the kind of example where you're like, oh yeah, let me get one too.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and change the address in this account real quick.
Yeah.
Hey, wasn't there a fairly popular company who also had a problem with this particular issue?
Yeah, the big one here was Apple. When I think it was when they released Mountain Lion. It was the first version of iMessages that came out for OS 10. I believe that was in Mountain Lion. And the hack was that as you were configuring iMessage, if you were, people on the same network with you could hijack your Apple ID account and gain access into everything that's iTunes for you, or whatever you're using that account for. So.
Yeah, and also another example is sometimes with timeouts that are set too long, and someone's at a public computer, they just close the window, and you've got that session ID and a cookie or something. The next person that comes along pops open, whatever website, Facebook, and now they're logged in as you.
Yeah, and speaking of the public computer route, one of the things I said too is, as a developer, we need to be conscious of that stuff and try to leverage cookies. And the main reason behind that is if you're passing that session ID through your URL, that's all fine and dandy. But let's say that you are on a public computer, the next person who comes up can open in history, and assuming that session wasn't squashed properly, they can just look at the URL history that was there, click on it, and then they're in your account. So, if possible, try to utilize cookie management for handling your session going back and forth between the server. If somebody has cookies disabled, okay, well then maybe they just don't need to be on your site. I don't know the answer. It's up to you what you want to do with that, but something to be aware of. Generally speaking, exposing things in the URL is never a great idea, right?
Yep. And another attack I really like here is let's say you've got someone, Michael comes over to my house and wants to use my computer to check his bank statement. I'm like, sure, what's your bank? And I type in the bank for him, go to bankofamerica.com. Then I, look at the cookies, write down the session ID, then hand him the computer. Here you go, log in. And then he logs in. And then if Bank of America hasn't changed that session ID once he's logged in, then I can run over to another computer, set my cookie to that value, and now we're both Muggle Outlaw.
That's evil.
Yep.
I didn't know there was two of me.
Yeah, not that I would do that to you.
All right. So do we do a drum roll for number one? Can anyone guess?
Yeah. What haven't we mentioned?
I don't know.
We've gone over so much.
What's a big one that...
And if you haven't heard of this as a developer, then you probably really need to listen right now. Injection.
SQL injection?
Injection.
And just injection.
Yes, injection.
Sounds
Because
so
SQL
dirty.
injection is probably the most popular, right? Because isn't it interview 101? How do you protect your queries, right?
Yep.
So that's probably the most prevalent one out there. And how do you protect your database?
But it's important to note, though, we're not talking about SQL, just SQL injection.
Right.
LDAP, XPath, it's not just SQL.
It's any kind of querying. If you're querying something, regardless, whatever service it is, you need to make sure that thing is locked down to only allow proper things, authorized queries, validated inputs, whatever it is.
And one thing I think is funny too is actually log injection. So if you know what someone's logging, framework, whatever those lines look like, and you're able to insert new lines, you could actually start inserting logs for them to make it look like things that didn't happen did happen. It's kind of interesting.
Oh, interesting. So if you're actually taking over a system or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways that you can actually protect your database?
Whitelisting. No, that's not true. So databases, you've got parameterized queries, you've got stored procedures that require the inputs to be matched. What else?
ORMs.
ORMs.
Good
They will
ORMs.
automatically do the parameterizing for you.
But just to be clear, stored procs don't necessarily save you from SQL injection. And there are several ways that it can be done. But in the olden days, if you had a query that had to be somewhat dynamic in the order bys or whatever it was trying to output, the way that people would typically do that is they would set a SQL query to a string value, and then they would exec that string, that SQL query. So if in SQL Server, for instance, if you just do an exec and you're passing in values and it's just basically plugging it into the string, you get no protection. If there was an injection, if somebody put something malicious in there, they're still going to have access to it. So if you are doing something like a dynamic query in a stored proc, you need to use something like SP execute SQL and actually use the parameterized version of the exec at the bottom. So there are still ways. It's not foolproof. Just because it's in a stored proc doesn't mean that it's safe. It just generally means that it usually is.
Well, it just so as a good practice, though, so there's some good practices that you can have there too, right? And for my personal preference, though, I like the use of stored procedures just to kind of break away the database layer from my application layer. You know, have that logic in its own container, so to speak.
Yep. And encoding is big here too for stuff like XML or other types of injection. You want to make sure that you're properly encoding for that format.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is also, Joe mentioned and kind of retracted a second ago, but absolutely true, whitelisting. If there are only certain values that you know should go into something, and a whitelist doesn't mean it has to be a value, it can be a type. If you know that a parameter has to be of type integer, then why are you going to let a string value in? So, you know, there are ways that you can actually protect before it ever even gets to your query level.
Yeah, that's kind of a recurring theme with this top 10 is validation and encoding.
So the big one here, the big example here, we've kind of already hinted on, would be the Sony attack. They got hammered. What was it, like for at least a solid year? It seemed like every month there was a new attack from them.
Yeah, it was a bad year for them.
Yeah, and the PlayStation 4 comes out tonight.
And also, I think anytime we talk about SQL injection, we've got to mention Dear Bobby Table's famous XKCD comic that shook the world. This hypothetical parent has named her child Bobby, and last name is single quote, semicolon, drop tables. That might have been the middle name, but yeah, so the school calls this parent up and is a little upset with what had just happened to their database.
Yeah, and by the way, chances are somebody's not going to do a drop table on you unless they're just really mad at you. Usually what they're going to be doing is trying to mine the data out of your database. And, you know, that's the dangerous part.
Yeah, you're lucky if it's just a drop.
Yeah, if it's just a drop, then, you know, hopefully you have a backup somewhere. The worst case scenario, they're going to walk off with your data and expose, you know, tons of usernames, personal information, much like Sony.
So let's see some predictions here. Like we're coming up on 2014. Who wants? What do we want to do? Top 1, top 2? What do you think going into 2014?
So I've got a prediction here. This year, 2013, Edward Snowden made a name for himself by...
Who's that guy?
Yeah, so I'm releasing some documents.
What's his Twitter handle?
I don't know. Why would I know that? But he made a name for himself by releasing some documents from the NSA showing that there's a whole lot more spying going on than... Well, I guess the tinfoil hats knew all along, but there's a whole lot of spying going on. And so I expect that a lot more people are going to be looking at encryption for their companies and organizations, and I expect a lot of them are going to do it wrong. So I'm guessing the number one, or at least moving into top 3, is security misconfiguration.
Interesting. Yeah. Mine is actually going to be... I think the Crosssite scripting has become more of a big problem because of smartphones. That's what I think that people on their phones feel safe for some reason, and I don't think they take the same precautions they do with Windows because Microsoft has always been bad, whatever. So I have a feeling there's going to be exploits that somehow allow lower level access to systems on phones that are really going to cause some problems. Because, I mean, people keep their lives on their phones. And that's where I think attacks are going to go.
I actually thought Joe was maybe going to take mine as he was going down that route, because I was thinking that sensitive data exposure would move.
Oh.
For a similar reason.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't
Down or
know.
up?
Well, it's closer to 1. So up, I guess.
Yeah.
Or, unless you're looking at it numerically, I guess it would be maybe down.
You're
Whatever.
talking about the highest priority.
Yeah, I
worst.
was thinking that sensitive data exposure might move in position, like I said, based on similar reasons that you gave.
Yep.
When you were
Like,
saying
maybe
it,
we
I'm
should
like,
be passing
dang,
this
he's
stuff
about to take
around.
mine. We should discuss these.
Maybe we should be passing this company information around in plain tech. Yeah, interesting.
Well, I mean, Google's been making strides. I mean, they have been quite vocally pissed off about, finding out just how, their own government has been kind of taking advantage of their offerings. So they've been doing a lot to encrypt everything end to end and SSL everywhere. So
Yep.
Yeah.
And just in case you have been living on a rock and you're not familiar with some of the stuff we've been talking to, I highly recommend checking out a podcast called Security Now, where they talk a lot about the stuff that's going on, or actually made quite a name for themselves by predicting a lot of things that were later revealed about Prism and Snowden and the NSA and a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah. Great stuff in that podcast.
yes, Steve Gibson is like my hero.
Yeah. That kind of takes us into our next section. We want to talk about some application security tools and resources like Security Now. Also, there's some pretty cool tools we discovered. I can't say this.
It was Havage.
Havage.
It was a security injection test tool. So it's got 2 versions, a paid and a free version. But yeah, I mean, it looked pretty cool. I don't know. I haven't done any SQL injection testing on my own, but when I found out about this tool, I was like, well, that's actually kind of neat. I kind of want to play with it.
Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, use it against your own site, right?
Not in production.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in production, right? Yeah. No, but I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, a lot of these tools can be used for harm, but they can also be used to help you solidify your own site.
Well, yeah. So to that point, though, you got to believe that it's out there. So any hacker that wanted to, they're going to be using it too.
Yep.
And if you are going to be kind of hacking away on your own dev site, you might want to be careful with what fields you delete or mess with, because someone else might be working on them at the time as well, and be a little confused about their data being manipulated. Sorry, Michael.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Some other tools, Backtrack Linux is a distribution. It's pretty much made specifically for security testing and looking for exploits, Metasploit's another tool for it's a really great. It really bundles up these exploits and makes them really easy to exploit. So you can kind of double click, it'll run through a bunch of stuff and then give you shell access, something like that. So you don't even know what's going on underneath. You just kind of typed in the computer name, and there you go. Burp is kind of a cool tool. Burp Suite. It's a Java application that's good for really all sorts of stuff. But it can act as a man in the middle. It can repeat requests. It can act as a fuzzer to try and kind of fill in data and look for exploits on your site. And also something like Fiddler is a great lightweight tool for just kind of seeing the communication that goes back and forth between your client and your website.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not only interesting for that, it's also because you got to believe that if somebody wanted to attack your site, they're going to use a tool like that to see what's being sent back and forth too. So you might as well be on the on the edge of that too, using it to see what you're actually sending back and forth to make sure you're not sending it back something you didn't mean to.
Yeah, that's why I have all these tools, right?
Yeah, that's that cross-site request forgery. Fiddler makes it stupid easy to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but again, it's supposed to be for development purposes. So, you know.
And there's a whole book written specifically about Metasploit. There's actually a pretty cool book, I just remember now, called, I think it's called Gray Hat Hacking with Python. It's pretty cool. It actually will have you go through and build things like debuggers and fuzzers, and it gives you a nice overview or like a nice kind of understanding of what these tools are and what they're used for. And speaking of books, there's actually a lot of really good books, and specifically audio books, because I know you guys are probably audio fans if you're listening to this show. But Audible has a lot of really good books from Bruce Schneier, also Kevin Mitnick, who's famous for writing The Art of Deception, another book called America the Vulnerable. And you can listen to these books, and pretty cool.
Awesome.
All right, so with that, let's get into the tip of the week, or tips of the week.
Yep. And I wanted to mention a website called Cloudcracker, which is a suite of tools specifically for cracking secrets and passwords. And so you can go to this website, give me your credit card number, and upload some information, and then they'll give you like, I don't know the prices offhand, but it'd be like, they'll crack a WPA2 password for $5, or they'll crack RSA password for 150 or whatever. And they'll even show you like average times, and you just kind of get an email saying, here's your password. You're welcome.
Wow.
All right, so with that, I had two that I wanted to. They're both kind of small, but I thought they would both be of value. These are within Visual Studio, so everybody knows about breakpoints, right? When you're debugging something, I think Alan had a couple episodes back. He had mentioned a tip about using named breakpoints. So, one thing you can do while you're debugging your code is you've already gotten at your breakpoint or past your breakpoint, and you're kind of just stepping a few lines through it. And later on, there might be like a for loop that you want to skip, and you can go to a line past that and Control F10, and it'll just automatically execute all the way to where your cursor is currently at. But another cool thing that you can do with that is, let's say that you're not in a debug session, right? And you want to test something, and you don't really care to set a breakpoint, but you're like, you know what? I just want to run the application to where my cursor is right now. Boom, Control F10, and it'll start a debug session. And while you haven't added a breakpoint, it'll run it to where your cursor is, and then stop for you right there.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of like an ad hoc breakpoint that can happen for you. And so that's the first one that I wanted to mention. But then the second one is that if you do actually want to set a breakpoint, one thing that's very convenient is if after you've set your breakpoint, you can right-click on it and add a condition to it to say, only stop when this statement is true. And then that way, if you're running through a list of like 10,000 names or something like that, whatever it might be, you're only going to get to it in those circumstances that you actually want to stop and see what's happening.
Yeah, I thought I mentioned too. I've noticed a lot of people don't realize this is you can actually drag that little yellow debugging arrow up in a lot of cases. Some situations where it doesn't work, but if you ever kind of F10 past the thing you wanted to see, you're like, oh no, you can actually just click on that arrow and drag it up a few lines and replay it.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's a little wonky sometimes, because values might already be set, whatever. But sometimes it's pretty useful.
Huh. All right. Well, I guess my particular tip of the week is something that just kind of came up tonight. And please don't use this on our site. If you're going to use it, use it. But it's a website called mailinator.com. And like, if you're ever looking up information or you just want access to that one thing on the site and you don't want to get spammed with emails and all kinds of stuff, you don't want to put in your user, or you don't want to put in your own email because you're just like, God, I really don't want to sign up for more spam. you can go to mailinator.com and you can literally create any kind of mailbox you want because it's public. Everybody in the world will be able to see it. It doesn't matter. But what it allows you to do is put in an email address. We'll call it alan@mailinator.com. You plug that into the site that you're trying to get some information from. You can actually go over to Mailinator, retrieve the email, which, by the way, will be blown away in 30 minutes, an hour, something like that. But then you'll be able to go click the link, confirm that you have a real email address, and then go in and, get the information you want. So, again, I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart to save you from a ton of spam. We won't spam you. Please, if you're going to sign up for our newsletter, just go ahead and do it.
I think this might be only for the parents out there, but is it just me, or does this sound like one of the innators made by Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz? For all the Phineas and Ferb fans out there.
Man.
Nice.
But I can tell you right now, like, this tool is invaluable if you need it. So, again, you should not need it for coding blocks because we will send you nothing but quality, good content, right?
I'm just expecting like Perry the Platypus to come busting in about this innator.
Oh, before we close up, I do want to say, recently we've put some posts up about like some JavaScript frameworks and things like that. If there's anything that you guys would specifically want to know about or want us to spend some time talking about, please, let us know. Contact us. Are you interested in, I don't know, whatever. Just let us know. So,
Angular.
Yes, Angular, please no. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I don't hate Angular.
All right, so with that, we'll be putting up the links in the show notes and everything up on the site.
Yes, and go ahead and subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and whatever your favorite podcasting app is, and be sure to leave us some reviews on iTunes and Stitcher. That'll help us jump up in the ranks and give us some motivation to come to you a little bit more often even. And visit us on codingblocks.net where you can find our show notes, examples, discussion, and more. And send your feedbacks, questions, rants, comments, and everything else to comments@codingblocks.net.